Alright, it's 1 p.m., so welcome to Live from the Birmingham Museum. And today we're going to talk about, Donna and I, we started investigating a couple things from the cemetery that we wanted to talk about. But then we kind of fell down rabbit holes, as you do, and we started coming across these really unusual names for the 21st century. And then we started looking into, where do these names come from?
Right.
If you were alive in 1822, like, where would you find inspiration for baby names?
Yes.
Because we kind of have this idea that people in the past had very traditional names. So, like, everyone was John or Robert or Mary or, you know, Anna. But that is certainly not the case.
No.
And I think for a lot of people at home who are reading books set in the past, reading historical documents, or doing their own genealogical research, they've probably come across some really fascinating names. And so, you know, we are no different. But before we begin, I do want to talk about our cemetery tour on September 26th. You might have gotten an email from the city of Birmingham that incorrectly stated the date. It was the 16th. They've set out a correction, but if you haven't gotten it, it's actually the 26th at 1 p.m. This is actually an old sign that we used to have at the museum to denote when a cemetery tour was happening. It lives in my office now because I love it. It's kind of old, it's creepy. It's a good historical artifact from the history of the museum. And then for the tour, 1 p.m., $10 per person at the gate. We will be social distancing. We will be asking everyone to wear a mask, and we do now have voice amplifiers.
Yay!
So even when we are socially distancing, it won't be hard to hear still. So come out if you can. The Friends of the Birmingham Museum, they always do a fantastic job with the tour, and I know I've always enjoyed it when I've gone. So I guess, like, diving in, Donna, tell us about the rabbit hole that started all of this.
So the rabbit hole that started all this was Amy Oatman, and she is in a burial plot for the Blakesleys, right smack in the middle of the Blakesleys, but not with a Blakesley last name. And nobody knows who she is, where she went to. Some people attributed her to Thankful Blakesley, which was Scriba Blakesley, like a whole bunch of weird names going on already. Scriba Blakesley's first wife, because there's no record that this person Amy ever married Scriba until you start looking into newspapers. She was the runaway bride.
Oh.
Yeah, so Scriba put out a newspaper ad going, "Hey, I'm looking for my wife Amy." Right. So we're like, okay, well, you know, marriage certificates, iffy. Back in the 1830s, 1840s, but Thankful had died in the 30s, and they had a son, Bela, spelled B-E-L-L-A.
Okay.
But everybody kept saying, well, maybe Amy was Thankful, and Bela was born in the 40s, but how was that possible if Thankful was dead? It was kind of a mystery, and I'm like, well, Amy and Thankful are two separate people. I know that.
Right.
So where does the Oatman come from? And that's kind of the rabbit hole. But then I was looking at, well, we were discussing, because I was like, everybody keeps getting Bela, that it's a boy, it's not a girl. And then we started talking about, well, where do these names come from? Because you had an interesting name.
Bela Lugosi was kind of the original Dracula.
Right.
Like old Hollywood, like 1940s, 1930s. So yeah, I was like immediately like, Hungarian?
Yep, it is. So, and when you look at a lot of the ancestry records, they keep saying female.
Right.
But when you look at the actual, like, death certificate, because we do have when he died, it says male. And I'm sure that the doctor writing out the death certificate is going to figure that one out.
He might have double-checked that.
He might have just double-checked that one. But Scriba's brother, who was married and had kids and is listed as a male, was also Bela.
Oh, okay.
And I kept saying Bela because I'm like, well, it's spelled Bella, but it's really pronounced, if it's male, Bela.
Okay.
Yeah. So just like Bela Lugosi.
Right. Huh, that is super interesting. Not a name that you would expect to pop up in Birmingham, because a lot of the early settlers really weren't of Hungarian origin, as far as we know.
Right.
You know, there's a lot of English ancestry there, so yeah, that is super interesting.
But it was a family name, apparently.
Yeah.
So, and that kind of got me talking to you because you had somebody from talk about a recent cemetery tour that was on video. Caswells.
Yes. So Linda Buchanan's cemetery tour video on Solomon Caswell. I was doing the captions for that, just kind of real quick, just so I could get it out quickly. And, you know, so she started saying his stepfather's name, and I just heard the first Ben part, and I was like, okay, yeah, Benjamin. Wrote it down real quick, got it down, published it. And then someone in the comments asked a question about Caswell Road and where did that intersect with the Caswell original land plot. So I went into our records and I was reading up on the Caswell family. I was like, no, stepfather's name isn't Benjamin. And I went back and I listened to what Linda was actually saying, and it was Benia.
Benia.
Benajah. So it's Benia or Benajah, depending on how you want to pronounce it. So then I went back and I redid the captions, so they should be accurate now.
But what was funny is I started going through another book that we have from the Daniels that goes back several hundred years, and I was like, Caitlin, we have another Benia. I don't know how to say it. This is where we need a TARDIS, so we can go back in time and be like, how do you pronounce your name? And then, you know,
and then peace out, because I don't want to live in the past.
I don't want to live in the past either.
And another, I guess, unusual name in Solomon's family is he was married a second time, and his stepson's name was actually Bacon. His first name,
like the pork product,
was Bacon. And I know that's probably family surname, blah blah blah, but I like to picture it as just as you should not go to the grocery store when you're hungry.
You should not give birth while you're hungry.
You shouldn't name children while you're hungry.
While you're hungry.
So yeah, two unusual names just right off the bat in that family.
Right.
So
yeah. Well, like I said, you know, with Scriba and Thankful and Bela, you know, I was like thinking, well, Thankful's kind of a weird name because you don't really hear it.
Oh.
But it was actually the third most popular name among the Plymouth County settlers.
Oh, okay.
Settlers. So that means like every third kid was named Thankful. Like,
yeah, that's true. Well, Thankful was one of the better names to have because there were also kids like named like, if he had not died for thee, thee would not have been saved. And it's like, what a mouthful.
I know. So yeah, so these are interesting. But we have to look at what was happening, especially at the beginning of the 19th century, because a lot of the names that we came across seem to have a very Greek or Roman god, goddess background.
And this is my jam.
Yeah, so this is all Caitlin. But, you know, if you look at the clothing at the time period, too, so Pompeii was discovered at the end of the 18th century, the 1790s. Pompeii is uncovered. They're seeing these beautiful murals. At the same time, Napoleon is invading Egypt, and they're bringing back these, you know, these artifacts and these murals and vases and statues, and clothing starts to represent that. You move from the very tight lace to those beautiful Regency dresses when you think of Jane Austen, the flowy cottons and, you know, the higher waistline, and apparently they just grabbed hold of those names too. And sort of like, you know, when a popular show comes on TV today, everybody's name.
There's so many Daenerys out there right now.
And so I think that's what happened at the same time, because a lot of the names that I came across, I'm like, well, that just sounds weird.
Right. Yeah, they're names that we don't really use today because that's not something really in our pop culture consciousness.
Right.
But back in the early 1800s, it was like you couldn't escape from it because authors were writing novels with these characters' names in it, and so you came across a lot of them. So I mean, we mentioned Scriba already.
Scriba, which was Latin for scribe, or a clerk in an ancient Roman government. So Scriba, I kept saying Scriba.
Right.
And then it was just like, when I looked up the name, it was like, okay, scribe.
Right.
Maybe it's pronounced Scriba again.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
how'd you pronounce your name?
And Leslie handed me this list of what she's come across in her research, and I love some of these names. So we got Sophronia.
Sophronia.
So kind of like Sophia.
Sophia,
Probably coming from the Greek word for wisdom. Vesta, who is a Roman deity.
Yeah, the Vestal Virgins.
Yes.
Even I know that one.
Yes, and then we have Xenia, or Xenia, which is my favorite. I saw that right away and I got really excited because this is kind of that Greek version of how you treat your guests. So it's like guest love. When you have someone into your house, you practice proper Xenia, otherwise Zeus will come down and mess with you, and you don't want that.
Oh, you don't want that.
So, you know, as soon as someone comes into your house, you know, you give them a meal, you give them a bath, and you let them nap. And then once they wake up from their nap, then you can ask them questions, like what their name is. But until then, so it's kind of a virtue name, kind of like thankful, you know?
Thankful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we have a couple others here, and I'll go through them really quick. But we have like Cassius. And then we have Marvella.
Marvella.
That is my favorite.
I just think of Marvel. I think of like the Marvel superheroes and Captain Marvel. Like her name should be Marvella.
So if you're a big fan of Marvel and you're going to have a kid, might we suggest
Marvella?
It's very nice. For a fandom name, it's not bad. And then Romanzo.
Romanzo.
So it's kind of like Almanzo, but with Roman in there too. So, you know, that's kind of cool.
Yeah. So some of my favorite names was, one of my favorite is Elisif.
Ooh.
And that's an interesting one because it goes back to 11th century Norway. And it was one of the most popular Icelandic names in the mid-19th century. It's like, well, but her last name also is Arity.
Oh, okay.
Which kind of goes back to Ireland. So sort of that, you know, were they Vikings in the past?
Very European.
Very European. But her mother's name was Orpha.
Oh yes, I have come across a couple Orphas in Birmingham history too.
So and that goes biblical. That's biblical. So Orpha had Elisif.
Some good names.
Yep, and then of course you probably being, you know, the Greek scholar, Sibylla. Am I even saying that right?
Yes.
Okay, Sibylla, which is prophetess or oracle. Again, Sibylla was born in the very beginnings of the 19th century, so right at that, you know, that Greek love, that we love really, everything Greek, everything Roman.
That really exciting time when, that part of the ancient world was opening up. Like we talk about, you know, the 1500s being like the age of discovery, but this was one too.
Oh yeah, it was huge.
Yeah, and so you would have been opening up the newspaper if you opened up a newspaper, and you would be seeing news like this, and you would be digesting it through like plays and all this other media.
Yeah. So another one, Electra. That was definitely coming from Greek plays.
Oh yes.
And you find mostly middle names, but several of our people buried in Greenwood Cemetery had the middle name of Electra.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, and then there was an Erastus.
Ooh, Erastus.
That's another Greek. That's another Greek. I do have to, not that this was German and French, but the Nixons, Volney and Chauncey, they were brothers, and it's just like, oh, what were their parents thinking? But then my last one, and I just have to say this one, it's not uncommon today. A lot of people today are like, oh, that's a very popular name, blah, blah, blah. Phoebe. Everybody's heard it from Friends. She made it popular. But it's funny because sometimes you'll be reading a novel, or I've had friends say, well, I can't get into that TV drama, it's set back in time. It's, from the night, they're trying to portray older times. Because they're using modern names like Phoebe. I mean, come on. And I'm like, no, it doesn't ruin the movie because Phoebe goes back. Phoebe was in Shakespeare.
Yes.
Phoebe was in
New Testament.
The New Testament. So Phoebe is one of those names that was very popular for a long time, and then it just kind of like died out. And then a modern TV show like Friends comes up and says, "Pooh, Phoebe," and now everybody's like, "Oh, this is such a great name." It becomes popular again, but people think it's new,
Right.
and they can't place it in history. I think you've got a name too that's
Yeah, so I mean, it's kind of one of those memes that you see around. There's a problem called the Tiffany problem, where Tiffany was actually, it's been attested to as a nickname for Theodosia in the Middle Ages. However, if you were to read a book set in the 1600s and there was a character named Tiffany, you would probably rage throw it across the room because it's a modern name.
but it's not.
Right.
It's another one of those names where it rose in popularity, died out for a couple hundred years, and then rose back up again. And so you have to really whatever old is all new again. I think
Definitely, yeah. And I guess going back to you talked about biblical influences,
right?
And I think that was another big place other than family and like pop culture that people were drawing inspiration from for baby names, because if you were moving several thousand miles across the U.S. to settle in what is now Birmingham, you might not bring a whole ton of books with you.
And I don't think they had baby naming books.
No. No, they really didn't. So, I mean, and if you were a Christian family, the family Bible, because that's also where you were keeping records as to, who was born when, who married who when, and all that other important information. So we do have a couple, more biblical names. So we have a couple Zibas in Birmingham history, and that is from the Old Testament. David meets Ziba, who is a servant of Saul, blah, blah, blah. Cool guy. Interesting name. And so obviously, some people were inspired by that, whether it was a family name, whether they were just reading about David's shenanigans, and they're like, hey, that's cool. And then we also have Imri.
Yes.
And Imri is an interesting name because sometimes you'll see it spelled Emery. Okay, so we're really not sure how it was pronounced. It's one of those other things that we need to go back in time and just
be like, pop in, say, hey,
how do you say your name? Please don't axe murder people. Goodbye.
Thank you. And hop back in the TARDIS and back to modern times.
Right, so it could be that, but it's spelled I-M-R-I.
Mm-hmm.
And when we were originally talking about this, I was like, I know that name, I know that name, I know that name. And when I was a kid, I was a nerd. If you wanted to keep me occupied for a very long car trip, the Book of Leviticus. Loved it. Loved weird little rules, ceremonial stuff, the begats. Oh, could not get enough as a child. This explains a lot about me, I'm sure. But then I was like, oh yes, so I've read that before, and that was actually in Nehemiah.
Okay.
And Imri's parents were giant nerds.
Oh, they had to be.
Nerds, because it's talking about, they're building the walls of Jerusalem, and they're building all these gates. They need so many gates. And so Imri is building one gate. The very next phrase is, but the fish gate, and Imri fish. And I was like, the fish family, we're full of nerds.
But see, that's what happens. That's what happens when you name your kids after fandoms. They go on axe murdering sprees. No, not really. Maybe this one time. But so Imri Fish did not like that joke.
I don't think so. And I think we're running short on time, so I'm gonna, my very last name.
Yes.
Roswell T. Merrill. And as someone who also really enjoys aliens, you can't tell by my hair, I love the name Roswell. But again, it's another surname being used as a first name. But I think with our modern day associations with Roswell and Mexico,
oh yeah, that's the first thing I thought. Green aliens.
Yes, I'm like, ooh, yes, Roswell.
All right. Well, we want to thank you for sharing our interesting names.
Yes, and if you have a good one from either readings that you've done or your own family, let us know in the comments, because we're just super interested in this.
Yeah. And stay tuned for next week. It's going to be a surprise. Maybe for us too. It depends on how many more rabbit holes we fall down. And don't forget the cemetery tour. It's going to be a great time. So come on out and learn a little bit more about the cemetery and some of the people that lived in Birmingham.
All right, well, thank you so much, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.